For those of you who I haven't met or don't know, my name is James Edward Mills, and I'm a freelance journalist and independent media producer based here in Madison, Wisconsin, also known as the ancestral homeland of the Ho-Chunk people, a land known for time immemorial as the Jope. And I want to, as I always do, to continue to make sure that you recognize the ancestral homeland of the people who once occupied the place that you now call home. Thank you very much for coming to the very first The Joy Trip Reading Project book discussion. I'm going to tell you that I can't tell you how happy I am for such a great turnout, for so many wonderful people to show up today. I want to just give you an ounce of background as to exactly why we're doing this. I have the pleasure of working here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison as a faculty assistant, and I teach a class every year called Outdoors for All. And in that course, I tell stories about outdoor recreation and environmental conservation, but specifically with an understanding of how we can make these natural spaces more accessible to everyone. And inevitably, people ask me to share my reading list. They're curious to know what it is that I'm sharing with my students. And frankly, I'm always interested in engaging in these really important high-level conversations. And so what I'm hoping to do is to do a little bit of what we do in the university classroom to actually have a live interactive discussion right here on both Facebook and on Zoom. And I wanted to start with one of my very favorite authors and one of my very dearest friends, Miss Carolyn Finney.
Carolyn Finney, sorry.
Miss Carolyn Finney herself. And again, I'm so glad that I can just pick up the phone or send an email and one of the leading thinkers on these very important topics will just say, sure, I'll do that. But I want to say without any equivocation that this event and events like it through the rest of the year are made possible thanks to the support of the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and also our sponsors that include Ceres Innovations and Outdoor Research. And if you stay till the end of the call, I actually have lovely parting gifts to at least one or two members of the audience that will give away in a bit of a door prize drawing. We'll pick a number of the number of people who are in the room, and you'll get a lovely prize that I will happily send to you. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And without any further ado, I'd like to, first of all, begin the conversation by asking Carolyn. Carolyn, first of all, tell us about you. Where are you from? And who are you? Who is Carolyn Finney?
Lord have mercy, that is a large question. That's a huge, expansive question. You know, where I'm originally from is New York. And at the beginning of the book, I talked very briefly about growing up on an estate that my parents didn't own, but they cared for. It belonged to a wealthy Jewish family. And they had the job of caring for that 12-acre estate for 50 years, almost 50 years. And I talk a lot about what it meant to grow up there as the only Black family, as not having real ownership over the place, but having real connection to that place. So that's where I'm from. But I haven't lived in New York since the early 90s. But, you know, once a New Yorker, always a New Yorker. And I've moved around a lot, both inside this country and outside of the country as well. I'm presently in Burlington, Vermont. I've been here for about a year and a half because I'm doing a part-time residency with Middlebury College, which is about an hour down the road, that I haven't seen in like a year because of the pandemic. But I was an actor for 11 years professionally. I spent 5 years backpacking around the world and living overseas. I went back to school in my mid-30s and got 3 degrees. I left full-time academia 2 years ago so that I could bring all those aspects of myself together to do this work in a very particular way. So my heart is grounded in the arts. It's where I stand. I'm privileged to have a formal academic background, but I privilege lived experience as something that we all have and how we bring our story. So it's why if you're looking at my website or something, I start off with storyteller, not because I'm trying to be cute, but because I'm trying to be really thoughtful about the way that we all have stories and can participate in this conversation. You don't need to have a degree. And I don't even think you have to work in the field. You just have to have been living here on this earth. And I think that's most of us.
No, I totally agree, because I don't have a degree either, but here I am, a college teacher. So
Yeah.
there's a lot to be said for being
Yeah.
able to maximize your lived experience and hopefully sharing it with other people. Now,
Yeah,
one of the
yeah, and
things,
James, and
which,
let me say that when I was working on that book, when I went back to school and I was working on that book when it was a dissertation, the primary motivation for me, beyond the fact that this work is always personal, is that my parents have a high school education. And if I can't have a conversation with my parents about what it is that I do, then there's, for me, that's on me to figure out what that means. And it's not about dumbing something down. It's actually about thinking about it differently. And what is the intention that I have in doing this work in the first place. Yeah, sorry, James. You know, I'm
no,
going
no,
to
no,
interrupt
not at
you.
all. I mean, but again, I think that really speaks to the point in that we are talking about very high level academic topics, but they're grounded in lived experience. They're grounded in people's daily lives. And that's going to basically get me to my first question. And I've had the pleasure of reading your book, and I have the pleasure of not only writing about it, but teaching about it. One of the things that I think is most compelling is the narrative of your parents. How is it that your parents wound up on this estate in Upper New York, in the Garden District of New York State?
Um, well, how I usually say this to folks is that, you know, my parents grew up in Floyd, Virginia. So Floyd is near the Blue Ridge Mountains, near Roanoke, Christiansburg, not too far. But they grew up there. They were both born in the 1930s. So they grew up during Jim Crow segregation. They both grew up in very big families. My mother had, I believe it's 6 sisters and 1 brother, and my father about the same, just in terms of number of kids in his family. But they were poor. And I would, you know, so they've known each other their whole lives. My father went to fight in the Korean War, and they'd gotten married right before that. And when he came back in the 50s, you know, he was looking for a job. And he told me that one of the first jobs he thought he'd try for was as working for the national parks, because he saw a park ranger in a park ranger uniform and he thought that looked like a great job. And what he said was, when he went to apply, they said, "We're sorry, we don't hire Negroes." And my father's kind of held that against the Park Service. You know, funny that his daughter became a National Parks Advisory Board member, but that's, you know, how life works. Um, you know, so they moved to New York, and that's what a lot of Black people did. They went north. You know, racism didn't disappear, but it, you know, it seemed to become more manageable. So he moved north, and my father had 2 job opportunities. One was 5 hours north of New York City in Syracuse, which he could be a janitor, and he didn't take that job. And the other was 30 minutes outside of New York City in Mamaroneck in Westchester County. And that was, you can be a chauffeur, you're going to be a full-time landscape gardener for this 12-acre estate. My mother was a sometime housekeeper. So that's really how they came to move there. And while the estate is stunning and beautiful, my mother, who deals with depression her whole life, that was one of the hardest moves she told me she ever did. And she, you know, it was hard the whole time, because suddenly you went from living in a neighborhood where everybody was Black, except for, you know, both my parents' mothers had both been maids for white families, right? So that's, it's not that they didn't see and engage with white people, but who they had around them all the time in their church, in their school, in the day-to-day life, everybody was Black. And a lot of those people were family and extended family. To suddenly move to an area where one of my father's sisters was there as a nurse, had married a Black contractor and lived nearby with their 2 sons. That was it. You know, and we were in a wealthy, very wealthy white neighborhood where we were the only family of color, where we didn't own anything. You know, we lived in this beautiful gardener's cottage. The estate was amazing. We had access to it. But this was, again, end of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? So I think, you know, for my mother, it was really challenging, because she did not want to be a maid. She didn't want to be a housekeeper. And so she would sometimes be a housekeeper for the wealthy Jewish family. But eventually she stopped doing it because she didn't want to do that. But my father's full-time job was, he was outside on that land every day, 24/7. And that land had a body of water. It had a small pond. We called it the lake. It was a pond with fish, and a swimming pool, and gardens, vegetable gardens, fruit trees, flower gardens. It's just a stunning piece of property that now has a conservation easement on it. But yes, it's just a stunning piece of property.
But as a child, I mean, you spent your growing up there, so you could
Yeah.
very easily say that you were born as a child of nature. That was
Well,
actually part of your growing
James,
up.
James, how long have you known me? We are all born as children of nature, as far as I'm concerned, because nature isn't something outside ourselves; it's something that we are part of. I know what you're trying to say, though. So
Okay.
I will say to you that, so yes, we had run. The owners were generally only there on weekends and holidays, and so what it meant was we were always outside playing. I mean, me and my brothers all knew how to swim by the time we were 7. We had to. There were two, bodies of water, and we were little kids who, on a 12-acre property. So we learned how to swim early on, bicycling. I played outside. There's a long curvy driveway that goes from the street down, to where the property is. And I call that the Piranha River. Like that was where the piranhas were, So I had a big rock that had a natural seat in the middle of it. That was my horse. Like there's just ways within which as children became really engaged with that place. But I never was thinking about environment or any of that. My father, he worked the land. My mother, they cared for the land. It wasn't, those ideas didn't even pop into my head until I returned to school.
Absolutely. And I think a big part of that too is the relationship that one has as being part of the land. How was your relationship with the land different, at least in terms of how other people perceived you as a person of color on this particular estate? Did you feel like you belonged? I mean, was it part of your understanding of your being there as a person of color?
I, yeah, no. And in fairness, I never really feel like I belong in most places. So that the sense of belonging is partly stems from the fact that I'm adopted. And so my parents thought they couldn't have kids, and so they adopted me, but then they had my 2 brothers. So there's a sense of, just my own sense of that, which is a different conversation for a different day. But also because we were the only family of color in that neighborhood. And I was a brownie and a Girl Scout, so I sold Girl Scout cookies. My first job was I was 13. I had a paper route, so I was always engaging with the wider neighborhood. I was a babysitter. I did a lot of the things that a lot of suburban kids engage in, in a very particular way. And I knew that we were really different. And I tell the story of getting stopped by police when I was 9. But it wasn't only that. It was things like I went to Mamaroneck Avenue School, which was a public school, when I was up until 6th grade. And it was largely working class Italian American. And you had some working class Black folks there, as well as a handful of other people. But, I was bullied from the time I would say 4th grade right until high school. And I was bullied by the Black kids, in particular, by a couple of Black girls who lived down the hill in a working class section of Mamaroneck. And the bullying was extensive. And part of it was because I lived up on the hill. So the things they said to me all the time were, oh, you think you're white, or do you think you're better? Because of where I lived, even though I lived there because my parents worked there, and they worked there in a very particular capacity where they were pretty much at the beck and call, of the owners in a very particular way. They relied up on everything. The roof over their heads was because of the owners. And I'm not saying bad or good things about the owners. I'm just, my perception of it, the owners were all up in our lives. When I used to be married in my 20s, the owners paid for the wedding reception at their country club. Like it is complicated. Up until 10 years ago, I was still getting a Christmas card from one of their grown children who's older than me. I'm in my early 60s, so older, who was sending me a card with a check for $50 saying Merry Christmas. Like I'm a, doctorate, professor, and I would send a thank you card saying thanks, and cash the check. But it's weird, so it's a weird, complicated relationship. So, did we belong there? I mean, clearly, one could argue that we put in a lot of time as people living in a place for a long period of time. So we're from the town of Mamaroneck, but in that place on that estate, we couldn't make the choice to stay there, even though my father, when the patriarch died and the matriarch in the 90s got very sick, and she was very close to my father in particular, and she wanted to try to figure out how to keep them on this land that was worth over $3 million with property taxes of $125,000 a year. And her grown children said no, because she even considered paying property taxes in perpetuity. She was thinking about it. And in the end, had a house built for them in Leesburg, Virginia, because that's where my youngest brother was married and living with kids at that time. So I don't know. I mean, I have a particular feeling about the question of ownership. And I think the other piece of the story I always tell is that when the conservation easement got placed on it. So the new owner came on, and my parents stayed on till 2003 till they found a new family to care for it full time. They, sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. The conservation easement got placed on it, and they sent a letter to my family. The neighbors did, saying we got this letter from the Westchester Land Trust, which I have a copy of, which talked about all the reasons why an easement is placed on it. Which, for those of you who don't know what that means, it means many things, but one of the things it means is perpetuity. Nothing can be changed on that. It's protected, and it talked about where that land sits in the watershed and why it's important in the wildlife, as well as all the flora. I mean, it just talked about everything that was on there and why it needed to be protected. And the letter that went around, which wasn't very long, with images about the land, thanked the new owner for his conservation mindedness. And he'd been on the land for about 3 years. And there was nothing in the letter acknowledging at all my parents who'd cared for it for nearly 50 years. And I'm in conversations now with the Land Trust, and there's we're trying to figure out something around that. But that's really when I started to think about all the people, Black and brown in particular, but not just Black and brown, but I was thinking very particularly in this country whose stories of labor and love for land and place are erased from environmental histories, are erased from academic and research tomes about these things, are erased from the big narrative, the nature stories that we tell each other, and how that kind of falls over into this place of we don't exist, we don't belong, we don't exist, we don't own. I have really particular feelings about it, and kind of grappling with, and I'm gonna be really honest with you. I'm always really honest, I would like to say, but I'm gonna be honest and say that I had to own, it took me a few years to own that by making this become a dissertation and kind of doing it in an academic way. I was originally actually living in Nepal in the early 2000s, looking at conservation and gender. That's what I was doing on a Fulbright, and because of political unrest there, I couldn't stay there. So I came back home and shifted. But my talking about it all the time was actually because of my deep sadness about I have no claim on the place except through story. I talk about it all the time. I realize it's the thing that's at the center of the way that I work. And in part, it's because I want my parents' legacy. They think they have no legacy to leave me they're in 88. My father's got early stage Alzheimer's. He talks about New York and the land all the time. But the sadness for me is that they think they're leaving us nothing because they don't have a lot of money. And, no matter how many times me and my brother say, you've given us everything, you don't have to leave us anything. The thing that I'm trying to impart to them is that the story of who they are is their legacy. And so I feel some strange sense of attachment to the idea that everybody must know the story, but the lessons of the story, which are very American in this moment in our history, they're so very American about questions of land and relationship and connection and story and power and privilege and race, and all the ways that we intentionally or not erase people from that. Good people do it too. For me, it's not about good or bad people. It's about just our very human existence here in this country and the way that we show up and how we've been doing it for a very long time.
Well, let's talk about that level of erasure, because your parents, their entire contributions for over 50 years were basically nullified by a land trust easement giving full credit to a person who'd been on the land for less than 3 years. Frankly, I think that's a very clear illustration of how people are constantly erased from the land. And that's one of the reasons why we begin conversations like this with a land acknowledgement. Why we have to think about where we are grounded in the history, heritage, and legacy of previous people. Why is it important for us to be able to have, if not ownership, but proprietariness over our stories on the land?
I've been so one of the things I'm working on now, I tend to answer a question with a story, is
That's why you're here.
my so when on my parents' 40th wedding anniversary, and they were still living on the estate, my father, who is not a romantic, he is just not a romantic. He's not romantically inclined, even though my mother is, he gave my mother a weeping cherry tree, which I was, for me, that's the most romantic. Like I was just like, oh wow, that's kind of deep. And they planted it, and it's really beautiful. And I'm going to reach over here because I keep a picture of it. See if, for those of you who can see it, if I up here long enough so you can see them, but you can see the weeping cherry tree, right? Here in the background, which was right near the house where we are. Um, and when they left, of course, they couldn't take the tree, right? The roots are in the ground, they can't take it. But when they moved to Leesburg, beautiful house on a half acre of land, they bought another same weeping cherry tree, which they planted there. Well, through a series of things that I'm sort of working on now, this woman this documentary film director who's making an HBO documentary on trees, and the New York Botanical Gardens is working with me, and we're trying to, and the land trust as well, is the story about my family as it is related to this tree on this land is a story that's going to be told as part of this film. And the last couple of months, I haven't been on that land, since 2003. Now, because of the conservation easement, and there's a second set of new owners. So the first new owner who knew my family is gone. He sold the land. There's new owners, and I don't know them, right, that are on the land. So we've been thinking about, both the New York Botanical Gardens, like maybe we can get a sampling of that tree and tell the story at the New York Botanical Gardens, which was really moving when they suggested it. Or like, okay, we're going to get permission. The land trust is all down. I'm not here to make the land trust or actually anybody out bad. They just said, yes, we'll help how can we facilitate that and get you on the land, and get permission for you to do that. The documentary film director, she was like, this is amazing. We will film you getting the sampling, and we're going to do all this. Well, just a couple of weeks ago, the land trust was able to get on the land. I sent them a picture about where it is, next to a beautiful fuchsia hydrangea and some other beautiful white bush behind it. I don't know what it was, where they sat right near the house. And they sent me this picture. There's snow on the ground, but all of it's been landscaped. It's gone. The tree is gone. The hydrangea is gone. And I have a picture of what it's supposed to look like in spring when it's there. And then there's the picture of it gone. I mean, it was like somebody punched me in the stomach, right? Because if the trees die, but when I looked at all three pieces had been landscaped, I said, oh, that. I think the owners just landscaped it. They just got rid of it, right? And it sent me into a tizzy for 2 days. I was just angry. And then what I have to do is work it into some creative fashion. So now we're talking about, if we could access the new owners, let us come on the land and replant the same tree in the place. And now they become accountable in part of the story, not just the backdrop because they have the money to own the land. It becomes something else, right? Which is actually more authentic to what actually happens, I believe, in this country around these kinds of issues. What did you ask me? I was leading someone with it.
And frankly, the real question is, how do we establish a relationship with the land through our stories? And that's exactly what you're doing now, telling this story.
Yes. So in part it is, well, I want to know how we engage in a relationship to do that. That stories, first of all, I think for all of us, that we are the owners of our own story, right? So I want to sort of start off there, that everybody has story. I know that stories get appropriated and they get extracted all the time, particularly, but not only, of Black and Brown people. Stories get extracted, they become transactional, they just get used in very particular ways. And for some of us, that's really all we have, is the story, right? And we have to build from that story in a very particular way, in a thoughtful kind of way. There's also something about, in my anger and something, so I'm writing a couple of different pieces and thinking about this, is that, to become a citizen of this country, you have to learn everything. You have to know the history, and you often know it better than people born here. But to buy a piece of land, you don't have to know anything about it. You just have to have enough money. What if you had to actually know as much of the history as humanly possible before you were allowed to purchase the land, because I want to bet that the new owners are really nice people. I actually want to believe that, because they probably are. I know that they have not responded to any of our requests, because they probably are like, holy crap, we landscaped that and we didn't know, right? That's what that's what I'm guessing, and I want to say, okay, it happened, right? And this is what happens all the time. People don't know the meaning of a piece of land and what that means, in terms of their decision making about how they care for it. What would it mean if we actually knew a lot more? And stories do that in part. Knowing some of those stories give us each the opportunity to honor not only the people, but the land in a very particular way, and we can't know everything. There's a lot I don't know. If you were to ask me, go back, 50 years before my parents, I actually don't know. So right now, the archivist who's working with the documentary film director is actually doing that digging for us to see how far back we can go. How much more can I know before my family? And why it might be important to know that in terms of thinking about responsibility, accountability. And then my story actually becomes more than simply about me, my brothers, and my parents. It actually places us in relationship to a history, right, that actually gives us so much more. So then the potential of belonging for me becomes greatly expanded to think about, what is it that I belong to and what is it that I'm responsible for? Does that make sense?
No, it makes beautiful sense. I mean, because it's frankly not unlike an environmental impact report. If before you know drill a well,
Yeah.
or do anything of major economic or ecological impact on the land, frankly, if we can have legislation for that, perhaps one day we can have similar legislation that requires the landowner to know who the previous occupants of the land were. Because I think that there's a lot to be said for the historic preservation of the stories of the land. And I think that moving forward, I mean, each of us are probably trying to figure that out for themselves. What is our place? What is our role? Why are we here? And I think that can ultimately, hopefully, define for us, a better view of the future. And in the 30 minutes that we have left, I would really like to try to engage our audience. We have a couple of people who've already shared questions. And one of my good friends, Bree Jameson, actually wrote in a question on her to me by email. Bree, can I get you to unmute your microphone and turn your camera on, and please ask your question.
Yes, thank you, James.
Hi,
First of all, Dr.
Bree.
Finney, thank you
Hi.
for all the work that you do. I am such a huge fan. I promised James that I wasn't going to fangirl, so I'll just get on with my question. One of the questions that I have is, so what is your go-to response for those whose fragility lead them to criticize your work as divisive? I do a lot of work with diversity, equity, and inclusion in my local communities. And one of the questions that I get from those who haven't done their own personal work is, well, don't you think that by highlighting a particular group, you're not being inclusive, but you're actually being exclusive, which creates further divide? So
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your answer on how you address that.
Oh, I got some answers. Yeah, thank you, Bree, for a great question.
Thank you.
Well, so the other thing that, I've been building this public platform for a few years to do this work in multiple ways on the world: advise, consult, give talks, facilitate, write about. I'm even working on a one-woman show right now about myself in conversation with John Muir, which, so I am trying to find a lot of different ways to have this conversation. So there's a lot of different things I say. That first of all, I have a strategy, right? So first of all, I only come into a room around this conversation when I've been invited. I don't try to put it out there like, please hire me. I mean, this is largely how I make my living, but I just said people have to invite me because they need to be accountable and responsible to that. You invited me, so I'm going to come in, and I'm going to come in like I would come into anybody's house. I'm going to meet you where you are. I'm going to be gracious about it. And I'm going to say some things because you're going to ask me. So I'm going to say some things. Part of the way that I use story, the reason I always start off with my own story, part of that is to ground myself in a very particular way, authentically. But the strategy is that I'm also saying indirectly that your story and your standpoint matter. Everybody is biased. Everybody here is biased, including me. And bias is not the same as prejudices, race, or racism, even though they kind of they can overlap and they can kind of bleed into each other. And you don't have to apologize for your story, but you just have to be clear about what it is. Your point of view about nature, the environment, place, race, difference, division, unity, whatever it is all informed in part by your own experience. So the first thing that I'm doing is inviting that. But the other thing that I'm doing with my own story is, and I need you to remember that I'm human, first and foremost, before everything else. I'm a human being, you know, so I use humor, and I tell some sad stories, and I tell some happy stories, and I tell some angry stories, and because I'm human, not perfect, you know, and I say some things. So I want it to be as accessible as possible for you to remember that. You don't have to agree with me. I'm actually not interested in whether or not you agree. That is way down my list of intentions. I'm interested in the engaging, because the engaging across difference makes space for something new to emerge. It is the emergence where the possibility lies, the thing we don't know yet, because we've come together and we're going to work on figuring that out. When people, I just had this conversation, it's funny, like 30 minutes ago I said, if I hear one more person on the TV say, you know, oh, this just causes division and we want unity. I'm like saying, listen, I'm talking to the TV set. I live alone and it's kind of scary, but it's a pandemic, right? But I'm saying, you know, I say, listen, I always say you can't get to kumbaya and have it mean anything if you haven't done the work. We have always been a divided country, which doesn't mean we haven't worked together, which doesn't mean that there hasn't been ample opportunity for us to come together in beautiful ways, and we have. But you want to tell me that when Christopher Columbus lost his way, made a mistake, got here, we killed a lot of native people, or we removed them to parcels of land, we enslaved other people, we treated the Irish, the Italians, the Jews, everything that we've done, that we're not a divided country? Really? What kind of psychology? We are messed up in many ways. We have been doing psychological gymnastics around the question of difference our entire 450 years of existence. There ain't been no surprise for me in the last 4 years. There hasn't been a single surprise. I've actually sighed relief because I've cried, I've gotten angry, you know, I'm stressed out, and I've also sighed going, thank God, because it's all out there now. Look, I just have to point there. It's always been there. But that is not all of who we are. It is part of who we've been. And it's where we are. And right now, it's just another moment. And so I say to those folks, here's what I believe. Here's what I believe. I believe that we can be better. I have complete faith in human beings to make different choices. We all don't have the same choices in the same day, in the same way, but we can always make a different choice. In order to do that and have it mean anything, then we've got to get real. I've got to say to you, these things happen to me. I am first and foremost a human being, but I'm also Black. Even though I found out a few years ago through a set of lies that actually it looks like my biological mother is probably white. Hello, I haven't worked through that yet, but the world has treated me Black for 61 years. This country has treated me Black for 61 years. On my amended birth certificate, it says Negro. And you know what? My Black adoptive parents did not decide to call me Negro. That was the state making that decision. There's a way within which that stuff has been there all the time, which doesn't mean that I don't want unity. I want real unity. I want to know that when you look at me, you see my difference and I see yours. And you know what? That's okay. We don't have to be exactly the same to do work together that takes us to a place where we can all show up to our fullest and bring what we need to bring for those big issues out there, like climate and the environment and food and poverty and all the stuff we talk about. But if we cannot be in real relationship with each other as we are, which means there's got to be apology, because there's got to be accountability. There's got to be responsibility. And I'm not talking about cancel culture. That drives me nuts, because everybody here, including myself, would be canceled. I don't even have to know everybody. because we've all made mistakes, right? I'm talking about, I get to hold you accountable or you hold me, but my door stays open. So okay, you messed up. Let's figure it out. I messed up. I want to do better. What does that look like? What do I need to do? What's the skill set I need? What's the capacity I have to build? Am I going to be able to look in the mirror and be honest with myself, right? It's not just being able to look at somebody else, it's being able to look at myself. This is who I want to be. You know, I think I've said it before. A few years ago, Svetlana Alexievich won the Nobel Prize for her work on Chernobyl. She's from Belarus. And when she was on NPR, and Michelle Martin said to her, "You pissed off a lot of people in your own country." She didn't say pissed off, but she said, "You made a lot of people uncomfortable. And, you know, your government's mad at you. Some of your people back at home are mad at you." And she said, "You know what? I love my people. I'm not interested in making my people comfortable. I want my people to be better." Right. And so this is what I say to them, Bree, and in so many different words. It's like, listen, every time I have these conversations, I love doing the work that I do. I'm privileged to do the work that I do. The idea that I can pay my rent doing the work that I do took me a long time to get here so I could do it. And it is emotionally exhausting to do this because I am the thing and I talk about the thing itself, and I've just worked at it. And so all I can do is pull out everything that I have to say. That, you know, the question I would ask somebody saying, you know, "You think I'm being more divisive because I'm trying to meet you where you are. You need to explain that to me then, because I'm here with my hand reaching out." Senator James Clyburn, he's a Black senator, congressman from is it South Carolina, I believe. A number of weeks ago, he said, you know, he was talking to somebody. He said, you know, if there's 5 steps between you and me, I'm ready to take 3. And that's how I feel about it. If there's 5 steps between us, I'm ready to take 3. That's what building unity looks like. And unity, building it, you don't just get it because you wish for it. You have to work for it. And you have to know what that is. You know, yeah, whoo, I'm raging. If I could stand up, I'd be pacing back and forth, Bree. I'd be like, whoa, 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 whoa.
Okay,
But yeah, I feel
cool,
yes.
cool your jets just a little bit. We'll get to our next question.
Take it off. Take it off. Okay. Drink my green tea.
If you could unmute your microphone, turn on your camera, and ask your question.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Finney. Thank you so much for being here. I know it's been a few years since Black Faces, White Spaces came out, and I'm curious, if you were to put out a new edition this year, what would you add to it or change about it?
Oh man, I can't see you where you are. Who asked that question? That was a great question. Oh, well, first of all, you know, and I'm not saying this to hear anybody say, you know, to say anything nice about the book. You know, there's a lot of things that I would do differently, you know, I'm sort of frustrated around the book. And I wrote it at a time that I was within an academic institution in Berkeley that needed me to keep it academic, and I pushed back. And the book was why I didn't get tenure in the department I was in at Berkeley. It was why. They fought over it for 2 years. People didn't like that I used story, that I used I, and it was still too academic for me and not where I wanted to go. It was a first attempt at trying to articulate these ideas in a very particular way. I wouldn't only do a new edition of the book, I do a new book. And so I'm actually working on a new book, but first I'm doing the play, because there's a way that I want to not only talk about the ideas themselves, but think about how we talk about the ideas, right? So I always say to people, there's the information and there's how we practice the information. And so what does that look like in the sharing? So I would be much more expansive about how the work is accessible, so that more people can access it in different ways. I would bring us to this moment, you know, so the smaller pieces that I'm writing now. So there's a journal called the Earth Island Journal, and some of you may know it. So I'm their new columnist. And so my first column is due now. Like I've just about finished it. And I'll be 4 times a year, I'm going to write a column for them. you know, about these things, which helped me practice writing in the moment. And what's always important to me is connecting these issues to the moment in a very particular way, because it's fluid. For me, life is really fluid. There's a way to say that it's not about only talking about the past or imagining the future, but understanding that the present for me is a confluence of those two things. And then how we show up in there. So that's something I'd try to do better than I did it in Black Faces, White Spaces. And God, I mean, do I have to tell any of you this year has been some kind of year? What? 2020, 2021? I mean, I could not have imagined that there would be a pandemic, that, you know, I could imagine that unfortunately another Black person could get murdered. But I could have imagined it would have happened and created, you know, between Christian Cooper walking into the park and having his skin weaponized and George Floyd, you know, within that 24, 36-hour period getting murdered on video, that these things would create something in this moment of a pandemic in a very particular way under an administration, which a lot of people weren't happy with. You know, I'm trying to stay open to that in a very particular way that created a space for this conversation in any real way. So there's a way that I'd want to talk about that. You know, I wasn't old enough in the 60s to lean into the 60s in the way that I wanted to. I always bereaved that I wasn't old enough to be on the streets in the 60s. This is that moment. Like, I'm like, oh, this is my moment right now. That's it right now. It is happening. So there's a way that I would talk about Black faces, white spaces, that consider this moment in that way and consider myself, right, in that way too, right? I have to take responsibility for my own voice and my own growth, you know, what may have changed for me a little bit, what has still held true. I'd talk about what has held true for me. You know, and I'd hopefully be doing it at a moment that I'd be feeling really hopeful. I'm generally incredibly optimistic and hopeful, but not all the time. And so I'd have to catch myself at those moments where I'm not, where I'm yelling at the TV and feeling kind of lonely and, yeah, bereft. Yes.
Let's get to our next question. Nina Marty, if you could unmute your line and ask your question, please.
Thank you, James, and thank you so much, Dr. Finney, for facilitating this talk and your book. I've really learned a lot from it. One thing I really appreciated about it was your recognition of the significance of art and pop culture in reconstructing the narrative of BIPOC in nature. And I was wondering if you can share examples of modern intersections between art and the outdoors, particularly examples that bring young audiences into the fold.
It's a great question. I want to see if I understand your modern example. Say that last piece again for me, please.
So I guess to rephrase, coming from the perspective of an educator, I'm really looking to create lesson plans through the lens of artwork in addressing BIPOC youth. And I wanted to know what examples of that effective integration you've seen.
So I'm going to come to this the long way, Nina. It's a great question. Is also what I've been trying to do. So one of the things that I do is in my residency is I teach one class, but they wanted me to do something non-traditional. And so I started it in the fall and I called it Conversations with Environmental Icons and Others. But the idea was I would have each of the students would write their environmental autobiography, a short version, 3 to 5 pages, right? And this is something I've been doing for a number of years. So there's a way for them to tell their stories, but thinking very specifically about the environment broadly defined. But then asking the students to now think about either somebody who's considered iconic in the environment, somebody who's considered iconic outside of that mainstream environmental conversation, or somebody that you discover in that same landscape. Now you need to go do some research. And and then do a performance. Either you can give a presentation. We had to do everything on Zoom. I have to tell you, you know, one woman who's got a South Asian background, looked at this village in India that her family was from. She did a dance. She did a modern dance with this alphabet that's no longer used and the way that she talked about it. One young man who's got a Jewish background, he grew up in Massachusetts. He baked bread, but he created an online, like there was some place you go on, like if you're going to a museum, and there was all these displays. So he'd use different loaves of bread to talk about his family and place. So a lot of it, what I was finding that they were really open to you thinking artistically and creatively about the way that you could come to the work. I often see art and see that in it, even though that's not what other people naturally see. You know, so when I think about Gee's Bend and the quilts of Gee's Bend, which some of you may know, if you haven't, Gee's Bend is in Alabama. It's this African-American community. Their quilts have gone all around the world, GEE'. They're amazingly, they're abstract and incredible. What makes them particularly incredible is that this is a community, you know, the difference between poor and po, this is po like really poor, and semi-isolated geographically. And they created these objects of beauty from the scraps that they found there. So for me, it is in part an example of art that is always taking place. So some of it for me is how do we retrain ourselves to see art? What is it that we're calling art? To understand that it may be, how can we look at something and see what's artistic about it? You know, who is making that art? How do we draw attention to that? Landscape art. So one of the things I'm writing about in the first essay for the Earth Island is when I was watching the inauguration and Senator Roy Blount gave President Biden that painting that was, it was called Landscape with Rainbow in 1859, and it was painted by the Black artist Robert S. Duncanson. And I was blown away, so then I had to do some research about him. The landscape looks pretty representative of the time of landscape. So, you know, a piece of the American landscape, it's kind of bucolic, and it may seem like nothing special, but what was amazing to him, to me, that a Black man, a biracial man with Black skin at a time during slavery could paint a landscape with a rainbow, which is symbolic of promise and history, and sort of take all of that. And I started to imagine what he was imagining was possible. So there's also something for me about how we see art. Again, I'm coming to how we see art. What is it? You know, how do we look at something with a broader perspective? Who we imagine is making it? I think I mentioned in the book, the Highwaymen, who were Black artists, almost all men except for one woman in the 50s and 60s, largely, who in Florida painted Florida landscapes. And they almost never had people in them. So tourists to Florida would buy them, not knowing whether or not it was a Black person who had been painting these things, right? Painting the landscape. And the art that they create, the possibility they create, the way we interpret that is something different. I want to say 2010, this is going back now, 2010, when I served on the National Parks Advisory Board in Washington, D.C., there was a project that was working between the Park Service and an after-school program with largely Latinx and Black teenagers who were, they took them out and had them go camping, you know, for short overnight trips. And I think it's Rock Creek Park in the DC area, the National Zoo. And then they would have them come back after having these outdoor experiences and then use their poetry, their spoken word, their musical abilities to write about these things. And we got to see some of those performances, which blew me away, from 15-year-olds and 14-year-olds who hadn't thought about, you know, climate change in that way. Those who talked about being out in these beautiful areas and then coming back to their neighborhood and noticing the garbage on their streets. Their changed point of view, which then changed our point of view about who they are in place and how they show up with nature in a very particular way, and said something about all of us in the room in a particular way. I could take a breath. Let me stop where Nina go. Nina, it's so funny because all the things move around on the screen and I had you there and I can't see you now. But that's where I guess I would start, you know, thinking about, I would think about how we can see art in the thing instead of only looking at art to tell us it's art doing a thing in a particular way. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And I just wanted to say real quick, thanks for the shout out to Rock Creek, because I am from the DC area. So that's really around the corner from me.
Yes. Yes.
Awesome. We have another question from Hailey Burley. Hailey, if you will unmute your line and ask your question, please.
Hi, it was actually my question, but I'm on Hailey's account.
Hi, see there.
So I was given an assignment to read a textbook chapter on the history of wildlife conservation in North America. And the textbook contained some just blatant factual inaccuracies, but those I think are relatively easy to kind of point out that that's not true. But in other places, it basically changed the historical narrative it was telling in ways that erased BIPOC history or misrepresented it through emphasis and omission and kind of what facts it chose to include in certain sections and didn't in others. And so I was wondering if you could kind of have if you could discuss the strategies that you use to kind of confront like these misconstructed or poorly constructed narratives.
Yeah, that's a great, what's your name?
Lucas Beck.
Hi, Lucas. Thank you. That's a great
You actually spoke at my graduation commencement at UVM.
Oh, I love doing that. That was fun. Yes.
Great.
So I have a couple of different strategies for that. So one is my long-term strategy. Part of the, part of me, the inspiration for me to do the one-woman show about a conversation with John Muir, and I'm calling it the N-word Nature Revisited, was because back in 2016, it was the 100-year anniversary of the national parks. And, and I no longer lived in California, but I've been living in Northern California for about 8 years before that. So John Muir is king out there, particularly if you're going to talk about anything outdoors. Was that I was at a geography conference and a bunch of us geographers were on this panel. We were all asked to answer the question, is John Muir still relevant? And I had some time to think about it, but I came in with this, I wanted to imagine. I said, I was so frustrated with always hearing about John Muir, even though I understood it's important to know who he is, right? But I had also read some of his works where some of his work, what he was saying was racist. And other works where it was obvious he was committed to thinking about non-human nature and the work that he does in a particular way. And in the end, part of what I started to say was, well, what if I take one of his works and imagine that a Black woman had written it? And so I made it kind of funny the way I did it with the audience. I sort of said, he had a book where he spent a year walking around southern states, and it was called 1,000-Mile Walk Through the Gulf in 1867. And I decided to call it 1,000-Mile Walk Was Rough in 1867. And I made up a character and I called her Sojourner Washington Douglas. And then what I did is I took real quotes from his book of things he was saying of the landscape and the Black people he was seeing. And then I took real facts of lynchings and stuff that were going on. And then I made up stuff like how she was ducking and weaving through a landscape. So I was using comparison. Then in another moment, I imagined a scene of John Muir and I talking. And I lived in Kentucky at the time, and inviting him to my apartment, and we were going to have a conversation. So part of what I realized is I don't want to cancel out John Muir. And there's a lot of conversations now with a lot of people about John Muir because of revelations for some in the papers this past summer that, John Muir was racist. And what does that mean? Do we take his name off things? Do we not? And I'm actually not a believer in that. I actually think that that's the conversation for those in that place to have. Just removing his name does not remove the history. It also, I use this example, and I apologize to any jazz lovers in here that I'm going to use this example. But Miles Davis, as a Black jazz musician, brilliant at jazz, the guy also beat his wife. He beat women. That's what he was. He was also, I'm going to say it again, a domestic abuser. And he was brilliant jazz musician. So what do? Do we stop listening and not acknowledge the brilliance and the genius of his jazz because he abused women? Or is there another choice? And what I'm interested in is the growth of John Muir over time. So what I look for is a way to make the relationship work, right? I don't, if I see a fact, my strategy is like, whatever that fact is, oh man, they're not even looking at this. Is that I'm immediately going, oh, so I want to offer this up, but I don't have to cancel you out to make space for what it is I want to say. So I'm always having to practice that, because if I come in there and say, forget that, we want to take that off the table, that doesn't even count, that's not even true, that doesn't even matter, it actually shrinks the space. Because what I understand in my experience, in my opinion, about the history of this country is, you know, and I say this very gently to all of you, that, you know, whiteness, white supremacy, whiteness is not a bad thing. Nobody can help the skin they were born in. You, me, nobody can help it. But whiteness is, as James Baldwin says, is about power. And so to understand the power of a narrative, to set up, you know, a way for all of us to go, the power to be able to say we and mean everybody without asking anybody. That's incredible to me. That's incredible to me. And so that we can tell a history and say it is the history of everybody and everything, as opposed to consider that it is an important history that is partial. It is like a multidimensional shape, and it's holding that shape in one way and understanding it. Christopher Columbus did come here. We all could probably agree on that. But what that meant when he got here, we all ain't going to agree on that, right? And we probably don't even understand all of what it meant. Because for a long time, and maybe even still, maybe the facts you're reading in the book you're reading, we're not even talking about it. Because some of us feel we don't have to talk about it. It's in the past. Well, wherever you go, there you are. And that past is always with us all the time. So I guess the strategy I would use is, I would offer to you, Lucas, is try not to expend so much time. I mean, honor your feelings in reaction to it. But this is for me to getting creative about, well, how do you expand that space? How do you expand that space on your terms, not on the terms of whoever wrote that? But expanding that space actually allows you to be in conversation with what is said. It allows you to be in conversation with what is not said. Because seeing that fact, you know, that fact told in a very particular way, in its limited way, is also saying something. And I want to say, because more often than not, I think there are individuals, they just didn't know either. You know, they've been educated in a very particular way as well. And privilege has the privilege of not seeing itself, as some of you have heard me say, and they didn't have to look at it either. They didn't have to consider it.
Carolyn, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
And expanding our view. It's 5 o'clock Central Time. That means it's 6 o'clock your time almost. Everyone, thank you very much for being here today. Thank you for an absolutely fabulous discussion. I'd like to thank everybody again for being here today. Also, please, if you haven't yet joined the Joy Trip Reading Project on Goodreads, it's free to enter. You're welcome to join discussions like this every month between now and January till the end of the year. I'm especially pleased that thanks to the generous support of our sponsors, we're actually paying our speakers to be with us. Carolyn was willing to do this for as a personal favor to me, but I have a saying, I think it's critically important: friends don't let friends work for free. And critically important to have these and expand these conversations. We're probably going to stay on the line for just a couple of minutes if anyone has any other questions, just in the interest of time and respect for the hour, and to close out the audience back home on Facebook. I'm going to close out the day. So thank you so much for being here.